So good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the Festival of Trusteeship. Hello again if you joined us yesterday, and welcome if this is your first session with us. I'm Penny from Getting On Board, and we're talking this morning about, is your small charity board any good? I expect some of us have got very short fingernails at the thought of what might come out of this session. But before I pass over to Nigel, who's chairing this panel, then a bit of housekeeping from me. So as you've seen, the session is being recorded. You will get access to the recording, and the recording does include the chat. Weekly pass holders, you'll get all of the recordings at the end of the week altogether. You've been muted as you've come into the call, so please stay on mute unless Nigel comes to you for a question. That just keeps the sound nice and clear. We've enabled closed captions at our end, so if you need subtitles, you need to find the CC or closed caption button on your device. Please absolutely use the chat to ask questions, to share your reflections. Please keep comments respectful and kind. And equally, if the chat gets very busy and you're finding it just really distracting, just ignore it. We will always repeat a question that we're taking from the chat, and the chat is on the recording. So if you want to catch up with it afterwards, you can. A reminder that we're holding networking sessions today, tomorrow and Thursday. So they're from 7:30 till 8:15. We will post a Zoom link in the chat later if you'd like to join our networking session tonight. That'll be facilitated by Ange, who's on this panel. And that's just a chance to meet other trustees and to talk about some of the things that come up in the sessions today. A huge thank you to our media partner, Third Sector, who have helped us shout about the festival, and an enormous thank you to Ecclesiastical. Ecclesiastical sponsor the festival, and it's thanks to them that sessions are maximum of £5, so we're very grateful to them. And on that note, we're going to quickly hand over to Faith from Ecclesiastical, who's going to say a few words.
Thank you, Penny, and good morning, everyone. I'm excited about this session. Being a trustee myself of a very small charity, so I am listening in. We are absolutely honoured to be sponsoring the Festival of Trusteeship again this year. As a specialist insurer and risk management partner for charities, we're committed to the sector and have been for over 135 years now, supporting the sector not only with our specialist expertise, but also our expert knowledge of the sector through our research. And some of the research we've done recently on trustees will be shared throughout the programme and the festival throughout the week. But we've also just launched our charity risk barometer report that includes our latest research. We surveyed well over 250 charities, and that can be found on our website, but was also published by Third Sector last week as well. You may also be aware that Ecclesiastical Insurance is part of the Benefat Group, and this is a group of specialist financial services companies that give all of our available profits back to good causes, so to charities like yourselves. And we're currently the third largest corporate donor in the UK, with aspirations to reach number 1. I just wanted to bring to your attention as well that we run a programme of giving each year, open to all UK, Republic of Ireland channels, Isle of Man charities or KICs or non-profits, called the Movement for Good Awards under the Benefat Group. So anyone can apply at any time of year for a £1,000 grant for your charity. But we're also doing a special draw this week only, for any children or young people charities as well, for £5,000. And we also have a larger draw each year for larger grants of between 10 and 100,000. So we very much hope you enjoyed the festival today and today's session. Thank you very much, Penny.
Thank you, Faith. And I wanted to, before I hand over to Nigel, I just wanted to quote one of the questions from your recent trustee survey. So the question said, what would help make your trustee board more effective? And these were the top answers. So in order: more training, better communication between trustees, new trustees with the skills and knowledge we need, better communication between board and staff, and more diversity on the board. So we'll see whether the panel and you as attendees agree. And on that note, I'm going to pass over to Nigel.
Thank you, Penny. Very kind of you, and welcome, everybody. So, is your small charity board any good? So it's by way of an introduction. I'm going to just do a few slides in a moment. We're only going to touch on the surface of the issues. We're not going to be able to sort out all the problems of small charities in 60 minutes. But hopefully there's enough in here that you find interesting, stimulating. It generates some questions, and that you can take away and mull over, and hopefully it's a useful session. We will have a panel conversation, and I do say conversation rather than discussion. I'm going to try to get some interaction in here. We've got Janine, Leslie, Ben, and Ange waiting to have this conversation. But to just set the scene and kick it off, I thought I'd just give a few slides and that hopefully kind of just yeah, it'll set out the first few minutes of our conversation from which we can then go a bit further. So let me just quickly from the beginning and just ask Penny. You can see that, can't you, Penny? Yes, sorry.
Yeah, we can see that, Nigel.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so Festival of Trusteeship, is your board any good? Thank you to Janine, Leslie, Ben and Ange. We'll be coming to you in a moment. What I want to start off with is a premise that, so is your board any good? What does that actually mean? And my kind of premise is that charity boards are there to make decisions. So a good board makes good decisions, and that's going to run through. So it's kind of, so what does a good decision mean for our charity? So just put it into context a little. Remind ourselves there are a lot of registered charities in the UK. It's a wide range of organisations. We have the Charity Commission overseeing with the rules and guidelines for all those charities. Our charity is not going to be the same as any others. So I would suggest that this definition of good requires some interpretation. And just to flag up, there is another session tomorrow afternoon in the Festival of Trusteeship, which looks at the differences between large and small charities. So some of the topics that come up here may well be taken forward and expanded tomorrow. But let's just recognise that the Charity Commission is setting rules and guidelines for a wide range of charities. So what's good for me might not necessarily be good for every other organisation, large or small. Topics requiring decisions. So this is a slide that I've used many times before, and if some people find it helpful, if you do, that's great. But to think about the topics requiring decisions, there's at the base of it, there's these topics, these decisions around control and compliance. Let's we say governance. They're essential but not sufficient. There are other decisions around focused on creativity and growth, realizing the potential of the charity working effectively, because what we're ultimately there to do and how we are ultimately judged is whether we make the impact that we said we were going to make on with society. And just to throw in one more thought on the appropriateness of systems and policies and the appropriateness of governance. This again you might find helpful. If that circle represents the complexity and size of your organization and the red triangle represents the systems and policies, then I would suggest that the first one there would class as inappropriate governance, high risk. But it also suggests that the second one there would also be inappropriate governance, too many systems and policies, too much focus on control and compliance, and maybe not enough on control and creativity. So those are the just to hopefully kick off some thinking. So I think that leads us to have a conversation around systems and policies and making decisions. I'd also like to touch on, if we have time, on how we achieve impact, particularly collaborating in small organisations, which perhaps is more critical for a small organisation than a large one. Open for discussion. And we mustn't forget that in this session, we also need to cover off how we actually assess, measure, monitor how good our organisation is. So at that point, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn to the panel, and I'm going to ask Janine, could you just very briefly introduce yourself? Yes, let's go each one of you first of all, just a brief introduction on who you are and why you're here.
Well, hi everyone. Really great to be here, and thank you, Nigel. So I've got a bit of a mixed background. I've been in trustee roles in various guises, from a large charity that employed upwards of 50 people, multi-million-pound turnover, through to currently a trustee of SODCN, which is the Small International Development Charities Network. We are teeny tiny, no staff. All of the operational work is also led by trustees chairing working groups. I'm also a chief exec, part-time chief exec of a small charity where I'm the only UK-based staff member. So coming at it from that perspective of how enabling really strong and effective governance can be for someone in that role. So hoping to bring that perspective to today's conversation.
Janine, thanks very much. Leslie, would you like to brief intro?
Yes, thanks very much, Nigel. So, hi everyone. I'm Leslie Michaelis. So, I've been a trustee for 15 years now. I'm presently chair of two charities, Home Start Slough and Bucks Mind. I think one of the things that I want to bring to this panel is I have provided support, and I was chair of a charity, Home Start Slough, that went into financial crises. A lot of decisions needed to be made to save that charity. So hopefully I'll be able to talk about those a little bit on the panel today.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. Ange, do you want to say hello?
Morning, everyone. I'm an associate of Getting on Board, as you can see, but I've been on boards and charities, boards of charities and other organisations for about 20 years now. Most recently, and I retired about a month ago, I've been the chair of a small arts charity, an Arts Council England National Portfolio Organisation, and I was a governor at Leeds Arts University, chair of its Search and Nominations Committee and a member of its Remuneration Committee. A bit like Leslie, I've also helped charities in crises. As a charity chair, that came on and inherited a real mess, but also as a consultant that works alongside charities to help them with strategic planning and so on. Lovely to meet you all.
And you're far too young to have retired. I think you meant step down.
Retiring, Nigel. Charmer.
Ben.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I'm Ben Wittenberg. I've been a trustee on and off for probably the last 20 odd years, mostly kind of smallish community organisations, kind of a lot of kind of sports and arts groups. But I think the main reason I'm here is I'm the director of development for Directory of Social Change, and we provide support and guidance for like thousands of charities, like kind of every year through like our publications and our training, but more recently our governance app, which is like a completely free online assessment tool for charities to kind of for boards to assess their governance. And I won't say much about that because I'm sure it will come out in.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ben. We will definitely come back to that in terms of this the measuring and monitoring. Let me start off by looking at the systems and structures for small organisations, and how do you know that your systems and structures are appropriate for the size and complexity of your organisation? Janine, thoughts on that?
I loved your diagram, Nigel. I think what I was reflecting on that question was, is it an effective enabler, or has it started being a blocker to the effectiveness of the charity? And I think it's also about whether the resources and expectations are aligned. And I think about my personal example of coming in as a chief exec, as the first time employee of this charity. I've got some brilliant people on my board. Some of them come from the corporate world, from big business, where they're used to being on committees that have teams and resources to produce options appraisals and risk papers, and aligning. There was some work to do in the beginning, I think, to align their expectations with the resources that they had available to them with one part-time member of staff. So I think it's about, fundamentally, is it an enabler, and are there the resources there to support it? I don't think there's hard and fast rules with what appropriateness is, but I think that can help. Yeah,
certainly there's no one right answer, is there? I love your point there about, is it an enabler or a blocker? So that kind of, it's almost a case of when you overuse your key strengths, they become your Achilles heel. Ben, any experience of that kind of overusing things and enablers becoming blockers?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, yeah, I love that diagram as well. I'm like, oh yeah.
You can have it, Ben. You can have it.
But I think one of the things kind of like sort of coming out of that as well is that it's more sort of the impact of the governance. It's looking at kind of like what are you making decisions, and if you're not, what's getting in the way, and is it the kind of processes, procedures and stuff you've got to, kind of too many things in place kind of blocking that, but also kind of what kind of decisions are you making? So are you making the, those sort of kind of in the moment sort of week, month to month, quarter to quarter decisions, or are you actually are you making enough time for those kind of, next year after longer term decisions? And have you got the kind of right things in place to kind of facilitate those kinds of discussions as a board? And especially some of the things which I think we'll come on to, but like, those kind of bigger, less urgent conversations around like, collaboration, or kind of, conversations around kind of like developing and doing things differently. Whether you've got the right kind of framework in place to enable you to kind of make those decisions and not just get kind of bogged down in the kind of day-to-day stuff.
Yeah, interesting that balance between the important and the urgent. And Leslie, how have you handled that in the past?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I would like to pick up on is that I think it can be, particularly, I think Janine mentioned it about business people. They may have some kind of expectation as to how this charity should operate, and those things might not be in place. And I've actually supported a charity whereby the board actually became a total blocker to any kind of decision making. There was a lot of people on the board who'd come from a business background who kind of wanted a sort of cost benefit analysis before any sort of decisions could be made. That was totally inappropriate for the size of the charity, and it was actually became into a situation where no decisions were made whatsoever. And things were just sort of kicked down the road, and it was only after a sort of restructure of the board really that needed to be done could that charity move on. So I think that that's a very good lesson about making sure that you've got the appropriate sort of controls and systems in place to enable the board to add value.
Interesting that the board, because we mentioned the board makes decisions and needs to make good decisions. This is a case where the board, I guess you're saying they were making decisions, and the decisions was to do nothing. So why? What was happening on that board that meant that I'm guessing there were motivated, intelligent people were coming together, but not take what was happening?
Yeah, so I think there was a lack of empathy with the charity and the way the charity operated. So as an example, it was a family support charity. There were people on the board who felt very strongly that all of the staff and family support coordinators should have targets about how many families they should be supporting, and they should be reporting back on those targets and stuff like that. I think when you look at the work, what the people were doing, to them, it was much more about actually, what we're here to do is to enable our families to not need our support any longer. So if that takes a bit longer and it means that I'm supporting less families, but we've empowered that family to survive by themselves.
Leslie, we're having a little bit of problem with your sound, Leslie. So let me just see if we can sort that out. I'm going to move on just to Ange. That having people on the board who lack the empathy or bringing in external viewpoints without actually putting them in context. Any thoughts, experience about that? How you may have overcome that?
So many stories, Nigel, that we don't have time for. But I think what I would say to boards, small charity boards, is you don't need a sledgehammer to crack a nut, as they say. And I loved what Janine said right at the start about our enablers becoming blockers. A lot of small charities get quite excited by bringing people in from the private sector, but it's that disconnect really. And how do you create a shared language and understanding that helps to build that trust and empathy? Because through another side of my work, I see a lot of small charity chief execs feeling demotivated to the point of leaving, where they experience the kind of things that Leslie was talking about before. So putting in things like inappropriate targets, things that are just really not necessary. Within a small charity, you can still operate within the rules, but you don't need the same degree of scrutiny as a larger charity might have. And I'm sure we'll come on to that.
Yeah, can you give any examples on that, Ange, where the process, the systems are in place, and you thought, really, that's your sledgehammer?
Yeah, I think I'm going to speak generally because I'm very mindful of client confidentiality. I was a charity chair, so I guess I had to start from scratch almost. They had no policy, so we had the reverse thing to some degree. Some policies were out of date, some governance policies weren't even in existence. But with others that I've worked with, the examples have been the board needing to sign off quite small financial decisions, so they didn't have financial delegation. Those kind of things. Again, it's what's right and appropriate for your board, which might be different for another board.
Yeah. Any insight as to why that would have been the case, why that would have been put up with, as it were?
Sometimes nervousness, I think. We don't talk about human behaviours on boards enough. And when people are coming in and feel a bit uncertain, you get that. And I think not understanding the way a charity presents its information, which includes finances, and many of us don't love finances. We're not finance people, but you have to understand them to be able to make decisions, but also having the ability to listen and not speak over others is another blocker, if we talk about enablers and blockers, that I see far too often when ego comes into play. And I can see Ben nodding, so I'll pass over to someone else now.
Ego, yeah. So yes, I was actually going to pick up on that. You mentioned, having the people come in and new people coming in with the right behaviours and the right, which kind of leads on to that, the induction process that we play. Janine, thoughts on induction for people who are coming in with skills, with the motivation, but maybe don't understand the context?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a bit of experience here because I ran a program for Lloyds Bank Foundation, which is about taking people, very senior leaders within the bank, and placing them on the board of small charities. And actually, as part of that, there was a real scene setting of a getting to know, because they were all matched with charities supported by this particular foundation. They were all by definition small. So really setting their expectations about what to expect as a trustee, that it's not the same as a corporate directorship position, or it might not be this, it's not the same as a large charity trusteeship, and giving them that real setting the scene in terms of the sector, its challenges, what to expect, what's needed from you, and how can you support. So I think induction, absolutely. A lot of the things that Ange picked up on, like there are some processes and systems that are incredibly helpful, and I would see as key enablers, like a clear code of conduct for trustees that sets out expectations that they've co-developed, that they've been involved in the conversation, hasn't just been lifted and copied and pasted from someone else's version, so they've all bought into it. Delegations of authority to subcommittees if you have them, and to staff if you have them, recognizing that not everyone on this call will. And I think just being clear on those expectations from the outset. We do ourselves a disservice, I think, sometimes when we recruit for trustees and we undersell the seriousness of the role. It's just 4 meetings a year, 2 hours, not recognizing all of the stuff that trustees need to do outside of the meetings, and to bring their full selves to it. So I think those are some things I'd be considering within inductions. I think it's a vital step.
Excuse me. Thanks, Jenny. Just to also say that if anybody has questions, get them in the chat, or get the questions. Penny will be monitoring them. We will pause every now and then and get questions from the floor, so clearly you can go anywhere. Then Ben, Ange mentioned, I think, about new people coming in, and she mentioned that word ego. How do you negotiate that? How do you kind of remove that, and in order to get an effective, get the contribution you're looking for?
Yeah, I think there's initial starting point, I think, with it, where it's, I think, you know, Ange and Janina both referenced it, but it's getting that kind of like shared understanding. If as a board, you've got a really clear and shared understanding of like legally the objects of the charity, like your vision for where you're going and what your strategic objects are and what you're trying to achieve, that should kind of be the majority of your decision-making framework. That should be the thing that enables you to take the ego out of a lot of the kind of big conversations and the big discussions, because does this decision versus that decision move us closer to where we want to go? It's not, am I right or are you right, or is my idea better than your idea? It's taking that sort of, you know, that agreed place, you know, journey that we're on, that agreed place that we're heading, and using that as the thing to kind of define, you know, whether one course of action might be better than another. I think maybe sort of linked a little bit to that as well is the thing around kind of policies and procedures. I love policies and procedures. They're great because they save you so much time. It means you don't have to answer the same questions over and over and over again every time they crop up. And I think if you can get those, you know, you can get the right ones in place and obviously appropriate to your organization and the level of risk and everything else. But if you're able to kind of solve those, again, it takes away a lot of conversations that otherwise might be about, well, is it, you know, am I right? Are you right? What do we do? Who remembers when this happened 5 years ago, the last time? All that kind of stuff. You can kind of remove so much of that stuff from the conversations that you're having and be then much more focused on, you know, the kind of difference.
You mentioned making decisions, and you know, I guess you didn't mention a lot, but having that total focus on the purpose of the charity, the beneficiary, you know, the external focus to get in the way. Examples of how you got that voice of the beneficiary, the voice of it into that decision making.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think that, well, it's not difficult. It's easy, but it's difficult. Well, yeah, it's difficult to find the time maybe to do it. I mean, it's one of the good cool things that we've done with the governance app is we get to see like the kind of anonymized data of the responses and things that come back. And actually having policies in place for stakeholders to feed back to the board and hold the board to account for their decisions is one of the 10 lowest scoring questions out of 70. So
could you just say that again, Ben, so we make sure we captured that?
So there's 70 questions in the governance app, and like organizations score themselves, like boards, trustees score themselves against each of them. And one of the 10 lowest ones is around beneficiaries being able to kind of hold the trustees to account for their decisions and to feedback and be part of that decision making. So yeah, it's definitely something that a lot of charities are kind of struggling with.
No, that is interesting, Ben. Thanks very much, Leslie. Anything you'd like to add to that? Because that takes us down quite a nice line of thought.
Yeah. So hopefully, is my voice
better
now?
I can hear you.
I think one of the things that to bring the service user voice into the boardroom, I think one of the things that we've started doing at Bucks Mind is we always have a video or a case study or something from a service user at the beginning of the board meeting. And I think that is sort of very grounding because it actually sort of makes everybody think this is why we're here, this is what we're here to talk about and to make effective decisions. I think also lived experience on the board and getting that voice throughout the organisation, not just on the board, but actually having lived experience throughout all of the sort of operations and the way you go about doing things within the charity is really, really important as well.
Challenges for that lived experience, challenges, ups and downs, and anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, so I think that depending on what the lived experience is, I mean, I think, you know, we've all, and I know that we've thought about, should we get a service user on the board, but I think that can create issues. So typically what we try and do is always get a volunteer on the board to represent service users. I think that you know, the board needs to think about if you're getting lived experience on board. I mean, we've talked a lot about business people on the board. You know, you may be in, this is sort of relates back to diversity as well, actually, but have you got the right processes in place to enable everybody to have a voice on the board who's perhaps not used to board meetings and stuff like that, basically.
Good. One of the you mentioned involving a broader church, involving the beneficiaries, the voice of the beneficiary. One of the challenges that smaller charities often face is the predominance of the founder, and the person that's been there for a long time, where has clearly got a lot of knowledge, a lot of passion in there. And managing that kind of founder enthusiasm and passion, and we mentioned enabler blocker, to make sure it's an enabler, not a blocker. Kind of thoughts on that?
Tricky one, Nigel, but I also want to pick up something really important in the chat as well. If I can follow on from Leslie first, would you mind?
You go ahead. Yeah, you've seen something I haven't seen.
Yeah, so it's because it relates to lived experience on board and diversity, and I think it's something that came up in our survey. I've got a really great example of a small charity that focused on homelessness. We have their permission to share this case study, but they had an ex-service user who was visually impaired, had experience of using that service's charity, started to turn their life around, became a volunteer, and were identified by the chief exec as someone who could make a great addition to the board. But this is where autonomy comes in, and this is what I want to say to anyone thinking about bringing minoritized groups onto their board, is how you provide support. So induction, training. This individual went through Getting on Board's charity board leadership program, which is how I came to meet them. So they were fully equipped to be a fully fledged member of the board. And I think this, whether it's a trustee that brings that kind of lived experience, or in fact any new trustee, induction is so useful. I know my fellow panelists have mentioned it, but observing a board meeting to see how it works and inducting them so that they understand how that particular charity works is really crucial, I would say. And recognizing that everybody brings value to the board, no matter what their background.
Yeah. Penny, is there anything coming up else in the chat that you'd like to highlight at this time?
There's lots coming up in the chat. I think some of the earlier questions have kind of been touched on by the panel, as the panel have read the chat. Let me pick out a couple of the more recent ones. So Chris talks about culture. Let me just find your comment, Chris. It can be tough for trustees and beneficiaries when the dominant culture of the small charity or the board can eat, brackets, ignore policy and procedures for breakfast. It's tough knowing how to move forward in those situations. And I guess that's a comment for thoughts from the panel.
Yeah. Okay. We can cover that off. Anything else on there, Penny? That
yeah. Rachel said, how can we get a robust rotation plan for trustees on our small charity? Some of the trustees have been around for 20 years or more.
Which kind of leads us into terms of office. Janine, thoughts on terms of office?
Yes, I have many. Really, really important. And I suppose it's a balance to strike. My first ever trustee role was with an organisation where the founder trustees were still involved. So linking back to your question about founders, the founder trustees were still involved 40 years later. And I think were no longer wanting to be trustees, but I think felt a sense of duty. At points the board had dwindled to less, to the minimum of 3, didn't feel able to move on, and had really were not up to date with in the particular field that we worked in with latest approaches, best practice. So it had really stifled the development of the charity, and refreshing the board, introducing terms of office, because the governing document, because it was written 40 years ago, it didn't have the standard terms that the Charity Commission now does have in their model documentation. So definitely introducing that. And I think it's a balancing act between ensuring the challenge that we had was that we then brought lots of new people onto the board, but then in 6 years' time, we were all due to retire at the same time and they were in the same place. So we had to adapt our policy to allow for a staggered extension. But that was just learning as we were going. But yeah, absolutely. Terms of office, I think, are essential. Not just when you've got founder trustees. I think it's important to keep bringing new thinking, new perspectives, new lifeblood into the organisation, but at the same time doing it in a careful way so that you're not losing that organisational knowledge and insight that's gained over those long periods.
Yeah, interesting point you made there about a founder who'd been in place, and actually, if they'd had terms of office, it would have given them the nice, quiet, easy way to back off and actually bring somebody else in. So it was almost if those terms of office would have been good for the charity, also good for that individual.
Absolutely. And I think, I've seen, I don't know others in the panel, I'd be really interested to see what your experience is, but I have seen so many examples where charity trustees have felt stuck. They no longer feel that they're contributing, that they're making a difference, but they don't feel able to move on. And that links back to the point that Andrew was making was, sometimes the work with those boards is to help them understand that what they're doing is not creating an environment where new trustees could readily come in and feel like they can contribute. They've maybe had someone in, they've lasted for 6 months and they've disappeared again, and not really looking inwardly at how their behaviours and their ways of working are maybe contributing to that.
Good. Ben, can I ask you, that area of terms of office, is that part of the governance app? Is that one of the questions that's asked, and how does it, if so, how does it rate?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a question around that in there. I think it links probably more closely though to the kind of policies and procedure stuff. And there's the thing I was saying before, it's like if you've got that policy in place, it becomes less of a I'm leaving you conversation and much more of a we have agreed this is how we ensure a regular kind of fresh kind of input of trustees into the board. So it kind of it takes some of that kind of personal decision away from it. I think the other thing as well, I mean, one of the things that we do at DSC, like for ourselves, but it's so our chair will have a one-to-one with all of our trustees over the course of a year, set kind of one-to-one separate conversation. So there's that's that, and we do a full board appraisal like every 18 months. I'd say full. It's not a huge exercise, but it's enough to kind of create this sort of culture in which there are regular conversations about our governance and about the performance of the board and about what our priorities are. And even if so that doing that kind of when things are going well means there's much better relationships across the board to have those tougher conversations when things maybe aren't going so well. And I think that kind of feeds into some of the culture stuff as well, where it's not just kind of having all those conversations when things are going badly. It's making sure that you're kind of building those relationships and getting them in place and kind of having that kind of strength, because you're a team as a board of trustees, and you've got to kind of work like that.
Yeah, it's good, Ben. Leslie, just building on that, I was wondering if so to follow up what Ben was said, but also just to ask you specifically. So, what are the if you were looking at terms of office, what would your preferred model be for that?
Yeah, so I absolutely think that terms of office are good. I sometimes wonder whether 3 years, and I think a lot of our terms of office are 3 years, and I do sometimes wonder whether that is actually long enough, because by the time somebody's got involved, understand what's going on, and then it's time for them to move on. I also would like to sort of just recognise that it is difficult to get trustees. So as much as we might all aspire to have a good succession planning and turnover of trustees, the reality of the situation is that can be quite challenging. And I think that was recognised very much when we were on the call with the Charity Commission yesterday. So I think that is something that all of us can sort of try and bang the drum about how great it is to be a trustee and try and get more people involved, basically. Because I do think that, charities are inhibited sometimes for from getting that board turnover because they can't find the people.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Leslie. Let me just try and take it in a slightly different direction. And Penny, if there's anything coming up hot on the chat, then by all means interrupt me. But I was wondering, when it comes to, you know, a good board, one of the topics that often comes up, and we've kind of touched on it in terms of risk and being risk averse. How do you create that environment where risk is seen not just as something to avoid, but actually something to take in order to grow? Janine?
Yeah, I think, sort of thinking as I speak here, so apologies if it comes out a bit jumbled. I think
we're all thinking as we speak.
This is a challenge I see a lot on boards, and it links back to the conversation we were having earlier about decision making and failure to take timely decisions. And I think sometimes that is people's response to risk, and understanding again where those human behaviors come into it. I think developing a shared understanding across the board of the collective appetite for risk as opposed to personal appetites for risk. And I always think of the example, I used to deliver a risk management training course for trustees for when I was at the FSI. And I remember being in the room with a trustee who had come from she was an insurance actuary. You know, she had to make assessments on a day-to-day basis about the level of financial risk that was being, her company was being exposed to give someone life insurance. And I had someone else who in a previous career had transported nuclear waste. And their personal appetites for risk were at totally different ends of the spectrum, but they had to understand and appreciate that as a trustee group, they had to define a collective organizational approach to risk and apply that in the context of their risk management. So I think, you know, it's about sort of, we all come with our own perspectives, but it's understanding what that means in the context of the organization. You know, the vulnerability of the client group, the complexity of the issues that you're working on, all of those things will impact on your risk appetite.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Maybe if we've got a couple of minutes towards the end to hand this back to Faith at Ecclesiastical to get her thoughts on this. One of the areas that often comes up in terms of risk and culture and that kind of thinking and being able to take a risk is and I think perhaps particularly relevant with smaller charities, is opening the door to collaborating with other smaller charities. Ben, thoughts on experience on where collaboration has worked, or maybe where it hasn't worked?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the kind of things that no one really sees from outside is that the charities are as competitive as anybody else, probably more so. And I think, you know, from a kind of small, it's sometimes hard as a trustee to kind of overcome that sense that, you know, we're competing for funding, competing for donations, competing for volunteers, competing for trustees, competing often for beneficiaries. There's quite a bit to let go of conceptually to make that step to kind of go and start, like, you know, working much more closely with another organization. And I think the sort of linking with the risk thing, I think it's a bigger challenge for smaller organizations where you're maybe, as a trustee, you've maybe got less of a separation between the kind of strategic risk and the operational risk. Where in a larger organization, the trustees might be able to kind of like be focused much more on the kind of like bigger kind of strategic challenges around that, rather than the kind of operational day-to-day stuff. But I think that's probably one of the biggest kind of barriers, is that sort of that threat of competition and sort of being in that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ben. Leslie, small
So,
charities in a competitive environment, competing and not collaborating. Thoughts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think one of the key success factors for collaboration is collaborating. If you're going to go into a sort of joint collaborative agreement, is to find a charity that has similar values to you and the similar ways of working. I think from my experience, what I've seen where we did get into a collaborative agreement, which was all around the funder that was funding the whole opportunity, which was collaborative agreement, there was a lot of bureaucracy. and it really put an immense amount of sort of tension and additional work on us as a small charity because of all this sort of reporting back. And looking back at that collaboration, I mean, from a service user perspective, it worked well, and we did actually make really, really good outcomes for beneficiaries, but it did have a big impact on the organisation in the types of things that you had to do.
Collaborate, but choose your collaborating partners carefully with a similar kind of feeling of culture. Yeah, okay. We've got about 15 minutes left, and one of the issues we do need to address is when it comes to, you know, is your charity board any good, is how to actually know. So I'm going to come to Ben last of all on this, because Janine, in terms of providing that mirror to the board, you know, are you doing a good job, medium job, or how have you done it? Maybe one or two horror stories, maybe when it's not worked.
Yeah. I really like the charity governance code as a tool to kind of look at and looking at the principles within that. The best, it doesn't have to be a, you know, I think, you know, full independent external reviews can have their place, but just introducing some simple self-assessments. So one of the trustee boards I was on, we had a new chair come in, and I would say we didn't really have a culture of reflecting as a board, of reflecting on our own governance. And that was something that she wanted to introduce. And I think rather than kind of hitting us with it immediately, it was just sort of slowly. So, you know, we started with having a bit of a process review, 5 minutes at the end of each meeting, you know, to reflect on the decisions we'd taken, whether people felt that they had been able to contribute and to participate. And that then evolved into coming together as a group of trustees, looking at the governance code. We didn't go into any very, very detailed self-assessment. We just looked at, we in effect, all of us gave ourselves a 1 to 10 rating, and an external facilitator facilitated a conversation around the real areas of divergence, you know, where I'd given us a 2 out of 10 for something and another trustee had given us 8 out of 10, really sort of drilling down and exploring that. And from that, developing a bit of a board development plan. So that was probably about 12 to 18 months from the new chair coming in to get to that point. But it was a brilliant experience as a trustee to go through that process. I also really like I came across it with doing some work for Association of Chairs on their Beacon program, but the 5 S's model from Julia Unwin, and she talks about different modes that charity boards can be in. You know, are you in scrutiny mode? Are you in strategy mode? And using that as a tool, I've used it quite well with boards that I've done consultancy work with, to reflect on, you know, where do we need to be as a board, and where are we actually spending our time, and how might we enable some of those other areas to happen. So again, assessments can definitely have their place, and I'm really interested to learn more about what Ben was saying with the app as well.
Yeah, no, that's good. Giving yourself time to ask the questions and reflect and learn. I like your point. I like your point about focusing on the areas where, because the board is a collective, is collective decision making, where are the differences? So if it's called a 1 or 10, why, and understanding that. And evaluating the board, you know, how do you know?
Very similar experiences to Janine. I also love the charity governance code and its tips for small and larger charities, and really drilling down into those. I also love Julia Unwin, Janine, and I think when boards do, you know, Ben mentioned earlier, I think it was Ben, talked about one-to-ones with the chair. I think they're super important, and the kind of regular check-ins, because those are the positive things that generate new ideas and innovation, and not just flag up risk or any possible red flags. And so I think that communication and building it, but also if you do a benchmarking exercise or an audit, not just thinking about professional skills, which can be quite an overfocus for boards when they're thinking about succession planning or something else, but also attributes and characteristics that are missing from the board as well. And they might not be things you would immediately think about. So with the Arts Charity Board that I was on, we'd had some natural trustee turnover, and we've recruited new trustees, but we'd got some of the skill sets we wanted, such as fundraising, etc. What we didn't have was someone who knew the communities of Bradford. Most of us were from Leeds, so we were, 10 miles away, 12 miles away. And so having someone that could critique our choices of artistic delivery was really important. So it's having that open discussion and having that communication with each other to figure out where your true gaps are and not what you think they are. I think they should be. Thinking about, we need a finance person, we need a treasurer. Actually, you can get somebody in that brings something completely different and creates that balance on the board.
Yeah, thanks. I love you. The 10 miles between Leeds and Bradford is a very long way. Personal experience of that. Leslie, your kind of appropriate kind of measures of before we go on to hear from Ben.
Yeah, so I think, I've been quite lucky because the charities I work for, so Mind and Homestart, they are actually federated charities. So we actually have our sort of standards that are sort of provided by Homestart UK or Mind. So I think that actually gives effective tool. But just reflecting back on the good governance code, a lot of what is in the standards is around the good governance code. So I think that is a really good starting point. I think the other key thing as well, to me as a chair, it is also about self-reflection and, thinking about board meetings, asking for feedback, putting that kind of culture and ways of working, making sure that is embedded in what you do, basically.
Sounds very much like having that culture of continuous learning. Exactly. Being able to ask, reflect personally and collectively, and doing it together. We've mentioned the 5S model. We've mentioned the governance code. We've also, of course, there's the governance wheel as well. Ben, over to you in terms of measuring and monitoring how good your organisation, how good the board is, and the governance. Some words from you to kind of round this bit off before I hand back to Penny.
It was bound to happen once, wasn't it? I was going to be on mute.
On mute.
So yeah, we've been working on this for quite a while. So we developed this thing called the governance app. So basically, and it's free. So I'm not selling this. It's free because of like the awesome people at Clothworkers, Lloyd's, Tudor Trust, and the Lottery who basically funded it. So what we did quite a big exercise with using the governance code, which is amazing. We simplified it. So instead of, depending which way you cut it, there's like 186 bits to it. We kind of condensed that into 70 questions, 10 questions in each of the 7 governance code sections. So it covers like organizational purpose, integrity, leadership, and that stuff. So the way it works is you log in, and all of your trustees complete it. So they go through and answer all those questions, and it gives you kind of what Janine was saying before, actually. So you get that you get your high scores in your areas, and you get to see where you're doing well. You get your lower scores in your areas which will be kind of highlighted as a challenge, but you also get areas where the range in responses is the biggest, which is the really interesting bit, because that's where you get to see, we averaged 8 out of 10, and it's only because like 9 people didn't understand the question and 3 people think you're doing terribly. So it's really useful. You can go through the whole process really quickly. It automatically gives you a report, which you can download, and you can basically use it's got conversation pointers and stuff for your next board meeting and everything. The whole purpose of it is really to kind of make conversations about your governance easier to have. So you've got something concrete to kind of talk about. It's really, so it's really kind of easy to do. It's good for the kind of conversations bit, but I think it's also good for the communication part of it as well. I think there's one of the things which we sort of really actively encourage people to do when they've done it is to talk about the fact that they've done it. So thinking about the that not just your beneficiaries and your staff, but also like thinking about your funders, who really are the main people who care about your governance, because they're looking in your annual report for it, but to see what you say about it before they fund you. But to be able to kind of say something better than the usual kind of, we have a board of 12 trustees, we meet 4 times a year and have a strategic away day, we've got these policies and those policies and everything in your annual report. You can say, we did a review, we were really strong in this area, less strong in this area, we put a plan in place to address it, and we're thinking kind of actively and really consciously about our performance as a board of trustees.
So you've got that structure for communication internally and externally.
Yeah, it's a much more kind of powerful thing to be able to say, like, to the outside world, but also to the rest of your organization, whatever that is, whether that's the rest of your staff or your beneficiaries as well, and your funders. And it's
an app that's structured around the governance code.
Yes. Yeah.
Just very briefly on that, how does the app distinguish between what I would describe the what's and the how's? So what you need to do and how you need to do it.
So we
haven't got long, but just very quickly.
Yeah. Well, so each of those 70 things, they're framed as a question or a statement. So you just kind of score yourself out of 10 against each of those statements. So yeah, they're all kind of, they're not identical to what's in the code, because we had to kind of rationalize it a little,
right?
Because otherwise it would take forever.
Fine. Good. Ben, thanks very much. I'm gonna I found that quite enlightening. Ange, thanks ever so much for your input. Janine, thank you. Leslie, thank you. And Ben, thank you for finishing off. I'm going to hand back to Penny. If there are any final questions, Penny, then fine, but over to you.
I'm afraid I'm not sure we've got time for them, but the chat has been very, very active, and there's been lots of helpful people answering people's questions as we've gone. So thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. I've posted in the chat a link to the evaluation form that will also pop up when you come off the call. We'd love to hear what you thought of this session. The networking sessions, just a reminder about those, because you've been a really chatty group, and we'd love to see some of you at the networking session tonight at 7:30 p.m. It's free of charge. There's a link there that you need to copy from my message there, which is the Zoom link. If you've come in and you've just booked this event individually, it'll also come on your follow-up email. Just a reminder that those sessions, which Andy is facilitating, are about, we're going to put you in breakout rooms and you can chat about what you like. We're kind of trying to reproduce that meeting at the tea urn feeling at a coffee or an event. Other events, so just to highlight a few other events that we've got going on this week, which I think relate to some of the topics that we've been talking about. We've got how to craft a brand new board of trustees. That's tomorrow, 11:30 till 12:30. We've got the difference between being a trustee of a small and large charity. That's tomorrow between 1 and 2. We've got Speakers Corner for Trustees. That's tomorrow between 5 and 6. That's 7 speakers telling us what they've been or revolutionise about trusteeship, and then you get to vote on them. I think it's going to be a real cracker. And then on Friday, between 11 and 12, we've got How Can Trustees Lead on Equity, Diversity and Inclusion? And of course, we've got the Lived Experience event, which Fiona's posted in the chat, and lots of other events too. If you've bought a ticket for this event today and you're thinking, that was fab, I want to come to more, you can convert to a weekly pass. And in your follow-up email, there'll be a code, which means that you can buy a weekly pass and get your £5 back from this session. So please think about doing that. A plug for Getting on Board in general, and the other organisations like DSE that have been mentioned here today. We have a big splash this week, but actually we're here all year round. So do have a look at our websites to see how we can help you. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Nigel, and the brilliant panel, and see you later in the festival. Bye, everyone.